Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 370. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to help support and inspire new trauma workers through this podcast and my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0. Thanks so much for joining me today, and here we go. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. Very excited to have today Dr. Damon Wood. Damon, welcome.
Hey, great to be here.
All right, so Dr. Damon Wood has held an interest in trauma-focused therapies since his graduate education and has completed trainings in Sensorimotor Psychotherapy, internal family systems, and DBT. Since 2009, Dr. Wood has worked for the state of California in forensic institutions, including Napa State Hospital and 4 California state prisons, where he's provided treatment to the severely mentally ill, the severely behavioral challenged, and the severely traumatized. In 2015, Dr. Wood was promoted to the mental health leadership team at Salinas Valley State Prison, where he's led teams of clinicians to provide treatment in one of the state's most violent maximum security prisons. In this role and setting, Dr. Wood has championed trauma-informed organizational support for the clinical staff that work in such a stressful and difficult environment. All right, Damon, welcome again. Share with our listeners where you're from and where you're calling from, and then let's dive in.
Yeah, so I am in Monterey County, so not far from the Carmel region.
Okay.
And I work, as I said, you mentioned in the intro, at Salinas Valley State Prison.
And where are you from originally?
Originally from Utah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
So we should say at the outset that we went to school together. You were what, 1 year, 2 years ahead of me?
I think I was two, maybe three.
2-3 years ahead of me?
Yeah.
So
that's where we met, was at grad school. So you were excited about trauma back then, and we kind of had a bonding around that.
Yeah, very, very cool. So let's start out. You have a quote. I love this quote. Let's start out with that. Share that with our listeners.
Yeah, well, so the quote is from Sir Richard, I always forget his last name. You have it right there, don't you?
Sir Richard Branson.
Yep. Yeah, Sir Richard Branson. So he is the founder of Virgin Records and Virgin Airlines. He's an entrepreneur. And the quote is basically, treat your staff well enough so that they can leave. Excuse me. Let me back up. Train your staff well enough so that they can leave. Treat them well enough so that they don't want to.
Nice. All right. So break that down. Why that quote?
Well, so as you mentioned in the intro, for the past 3.5 years or so, my focus has been more about, looking at how do we take care of staff? So I'm what's called a supervising psychologist within the correctional system. And so my task now and my role is to lead teams of clinicians who provide treatment to mentally ill inmates. And so, that's a really difficult setting to work in. Staff are, prone to vicarious trauma. They're also potentially prone to primary trauma. So because of the number of, we have riots and fights in these settings amongst inmates, but occasionally they, our own safety is potentially at risk. And so we have to have, a strong correctional awareness. We have alarms on our persons at all times. We have whistles. And so we're dealing with a population that has the potential to turn violence against us. It doesn't happen very frequently, but it does happen. And when it does, it can have a really profound effect on not just the individual who is assaulted, but the whole team. So my focus is really, and one of the things that I'm really excited about in talking with you today is kind of bringing the focus to the organizational level.
Let me just interrupt you because I want to get there. Before we do, so in kind of referencing this quote again, so was this a shift for you? Because as I described in the bio, you kind of moved into this leadership role.
Yeah. So, working as a, in direct patient care as a line staff at multiple settings, including Napa State Hospital and various prisons throughout the state, my focus was really like, how can I be a really effective clinician in providing patient care, right? How can I create that sense of rapport and that sense of trust for inmates many of whom have a profound history of being traumatized? How can they begin to open up and perhaps begin to deal with some of that? But as a supervisor, now I basically kind of consider my staff to be my caseload, right? And so how can I provide a setting that allows them to be effective in their jobs? And so this quote was kind of reflects some of my shift in emphasis, that it's no longer, as a supervisor and as a leader, it's no longer what skills can I personally bring to that patient encounter. It's how do I develop a culture and environment where clinicians can thrive and feel supported in very stressful environments.
I love that. I mean, I don't know if I've really addressed that particular topic on this podcast, so I'm excited to kind of dive into that. But again, before we do, so was trauma always something that you were interested in? How did this develop? I mean, I think our listeners can understand, once you start working in a prison, it's like, welcome to trauma. But how was it before you got there? I mean, how did that interest develop for you?
That's a good question. A little bit from my own experience, I have been held up at gunpoint several times.
Wow.
I've been actually held up at gunpoint 3 times.
What?
Yeah, I know. I won the natural lottery twice in South America when I was on foreign exchange as a teenager, and then once in LA. And each time seemed to get progressively worse. And that third time in LA, I literally thought for a minute that they were going to shoot me in the back of the head. So, so I have my own experience with traumatic experiences. My father, he was a psychiatrist, but prior to doing his residency in psychiatry, he served as a flight surgeon in Vietnam. That was prior to me being born, but it definitely had a profound effect on him. My grandfather, he served in World War II in the European theater. And so family history, personal experiences, and then I just found the whole topic to be fascinating, particularly with the kind of this revolution that we're having in the brain sciences and understanding how the brain works, and specifically with regards to trauma.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. All right. So your interest now resides in creating a safe space for the organization, for the people that are working under you in a sense. So let's talk about that. How are you looking at this? How is this unfolding?
Yeah, so let me kind of give you a little bit of history, kind of how I came to this. Prior to my current position as a supervisor, my most recent assignment was at Napa State Hospital. And that actually by far was the most dangerous place I've ever worked. We have Napa State Hospital has staff being assaulted there literally every week.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, you'd go through the gate, you'd go to the kiosk to get your keys, and there'd be a bulletin board right there. And 2 to 3 times a week, there would be a new notice saying that, someone had to receive more than local first aid because they were assaulted by a patient. Right. And so, it created, we had staff out due to, on workers' comp and stress leave just all the time. And it created an environment where it could be scary to work in. Coming to Salinas Valley as a supervisor, in this last 16 months, in October of 2017, I was moved to our maximum security level 4 enhanced outpatient program to supervise that. And that program specifically had been struggling for several years in all aspects, in terms of the level of violence on the yard, in terms of staff retention, in terms of caseload sizes. The program was practically in free fall. And the state actually had to intervene with some emergency measures to keep the program from completely imploding just prior to my arrival. And so when I arrived, there was a lot of chaos. And, so how do you build a mental health program given that kind of environment? I mean, that was basically my challenge. And 16 months later, I'm really proud to be able to say that it has stabilized. The caseloads have stabilized. The level of violence on that yard has dropped dramatically. It used to be, according to the custody officers, it used to be the most violent yard in the state.
Oh.
So the number of incidences that we were having in there would be days where we might have 3 alarms before noon, where there's suddenly a fight on the yard, or 2 guys on one, or a small riot or something like that. And every time one of these incidents occurs, the custody officers have to respond with force, usually, some kind of pepper spray or something like that to try to subdue the incident. The program has to go on hold for a while as things get sorted out. So everyone's treatment gets interrupted. And of course, the inmate patients, those that are just trying to go to their mental health care, their appointments, they have to worry, like, if they come out on the yard, are they going to be attacked? So it created for an extremely difficult environment to work in. Now, we've really turned that full circle. And so now it's a much more stable yard. But that took a lot of effort on our part as supervisors and managers to create the conditions where staff could feel like they could begin to thrive there. And it certainly was not an overnight process. So that experience is what really kind of turned me on into this this endeavor. I think it really crystallized for me just prior to this assignment. In 2017, it was July of 2017, I went to a conference. It was the National Commission for Correctional Healthcare, and they had their annual mental health conference. And a big theme of that conference was this topic that I'm talking to you about today, in terms of kind of this trauma-informed treatment within the correctional setting. But interestingly, they were really mindful about, the ACEs score, and talking about how it's such a difficult environment for mental health clinicians to work in. And they were there still isn't a lot of research, particularly longitudinal research, on the psychological effects of working in the correctional setting as a mental health clinician. Mm-hmm. There is research for correctional officers. So they were kind of using that correctional officers as an analogy, that research as an analogy, and, making the case that for mental health clinicians, it's probably very similar. But what I found was in attending several of these seminars and presentations was that oftentimes, when we talk about trauma, many times we talk about trauma and then we talk about resilience, right? And so there's that whole idea that trauma and resilience are kind of in this relationship. And if you want to kind of inoculate yourself to trauma, you need to really increase your resilience, right? And I think, the resiliency factor gets a lot of attention, as I think it should. And I'm really excited to see what you're doing on your website with kind of the courses that you're providing about, being that trauma-informed therapist, where you're really developing your own personal resources, right? But when you start working in a large organization and you're in a leadership position where you're responsible for clinical staff, the question that I had for these presenters, which no one seemed to really be touching on, the topic of what's the organizational responsibility to help the individual clinician develop their resilience, but also to provide an environment where there is less exposure to high amounts of stress and traumatic stress, right? And so I firmly believe that organizations do have that responsibility, right? And so then what specific strategies can leadership employ to help their staff? And that was basically the question that I asked this presenter. I finally got so frustrated, I raised my hand and asked the question. And the answer that I got back was, well, we don't have any data on that. And that was not, in my opinion, an informed answer, right? And so that's kind of where I really began interested in this question of not only how can I be a better supervisor, leader, manager, but then how can I really help my staff in an environment where, if we're not careful, we can really be vulnerable to high staff turnover.
Mm-hmm.
As you start seeing these behavioral kind of consequences of dealing in really high stress work environments, such as greater utilization of sick leave, greater staff attrition, people just saying I'm done.
Right.
More kind of interpersonal conflict. I think there's something to be said that for parallel process, that what's happening in the caseloads of the clinicians starts working its way into how the clinicians interact with themselves and the team itself.
From the outside, it seems really complicated. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, okay, it's a prison. Inherently, there's going to be violence and trauma in there. There's the physical safety, number one.
Right.
For the person, for the clinician working. There's also the interpersonal, education and inner work and self-care that has to maybe go on, certainly, but be learned and cultivated. And then there's that place where they kind of overlap, right? What you were talking about, the parallel process. So let's talk more specifically about what your thoughts are on how to address this, or maybe even what you've done, or what you're thinking about utilizing or implementing.
Yeah, so I think getting back to that question that I asked at that seminar, what is the responsibility of the organization to help the clinical staff, develop their resilience and reduce their exposure to stress, right? My concern is that in the model of the stress resiliency model, if our response to the clinicians is to say, well, I hear you're stressed out. What are you doing to work on your resilience? Are you exercising? Are you doing a mindfulness practice? We have to be careful. Those of us in leadership positions have to be careful with that kind of messaging, because if we're not careful, there can almost be an implicit message of blaming the victim, right? If you're so stressed out, well, then why aren't you taking better care of yourself? And so that to me just strikes me as very flawed as a strategy, right? And so that's why I take the position that I have a responsibility as a leader to try to create conditions that are more supportive, that are more, fun. So what did I do concretely? What have I done? One of the things I think is as in a position of leadership, I'm a big believer in leading from the front, right? So you've got to be out there, walking the walk, right? You've got to be able to do, as I'm no longer functioning as a clinician, but if I have to, then I'll, do a suicide risk assessment on a patient, right? I'll do the clinical contact to provide support when it's really necessary. But so that's one example. Another example is creating space and time for clinicians to be able to come together and actually process and be able to kind of talk about their experiences and have a little bit of group process if that's necessary.
And was that something that wasn't done, or not to the degree, or not with the attention that you're bringing now?
It wasn't really being done much. I mean, we have to be careful because, the employees signed up to do their job. They didn't necessarily sign up to be part of a group process where they're talking about their own issues. So, it's a delicate balance, because you could potentially find someone who objects to that and says, you know what, I don't feel I need to disclose my personal process in this setting. Right. So you have to be able to allow for people to opt out if they want to. Mm-hmm. But no, it wasn't being done much.
But also I'm thinking, I mean, yes, I agree with that statement. A lot of people some people might object to that. But when you're talking about a prison, I think you're talking about a placement that's really on one end of a continuum for clinicians, and especially silly. I mean, it's violent.
It is.
Right? It's almost like you need that.
I think so. I really do. I mean, the health of your team is only going to be as healthy as your weakest individual, right? And so I think the research is pretty clear when you look at the creation and management of teams, that one bad apple can spoil a team, right? And so yeah, I mean, it's very challenging. One of the things that I really try to be cognizant of is appreciation and recognition, right? Just really making it a priority to proactively go out and do concrete expressions of appreciation for the work that they are doing, right? I think particularly in settings like the California prison system, which is so litigated, right? We have so many compliance metrics, and our documentation is being reviewed continuously. The documentation requirements are off the hook. I mean, if you've ever done like an audit for what is it, Medi-Cal? For anyone that's done Medi-Cal audits, I mean, the documentation to be compliant with Medi-Cal is really high, and for CDCR, it's in that same ballpark. So the clinicians are working really hard, and a lot of the message I think they get is how they're not quite meeting the standards of the documentation, and that's the continual message that we're always getting, even how we're not quite measuring up. And so as a supervisor, I have to shield my staff from a lot of that messaging that's coming from above me, to let them know, hey, you're doing a great job. I know that we're struggling in these areas, but don't worry about that. I want you to know that I see that you're, working your ass off, and you're really putting your heart into this, and that's what really counts, right? And I think that kind of messaging and recognition really goes a long way. And the research is there to back that up.
I really admire what you're doing. I mean, on one hand, it seems like you're trying to bring this humanity to a place that can be perceived as a place almost lacking or filled with inhumanity. I mean, a lot of people think about prison, and a violent prison as, a pretty harsh place. And to work in that position, and to be a clinician in that position, and when you think of a clinician, who is modeling empathy and compassion, how do you keep those flames, burning in that kind of environment? My God.
Yeah, and I think you need, as a supervisor, leadership has to really, fan those flames, right? We have to do what we can to keep our staff still engaged, so that they're still feeling compassionate and empathic, and wanting to help those who really want and need the help. It can be a very rewarding setting. It is a very difficult setting, but can also be a very rewarding setting. So, the clinicians do many times feel a sense of like they've done some good work, and it's also sometimes very difficult. And when you have a program like the program that I took over that was on the verge of collapse, kind of resuscitating it is extremely challenging, because you've got staff who are about ready to walk out the door, who have
Talk a little bit more about the kind of implementing this creating a space for a process. How are people responding to that? What does that look like?
we would it would be informal, but it wasn't, but I try to create some time and space, maybe once every other week, for people to just kind of come together and say, how are we doing? What are we struggling with? What, or particularly if there's any kind of big incident that has occurred, how are people feeling with that? We had one clinician, for example, who, while she was in session, the inmate patient started slashing on his wrists with a piece of a razor blade in her office. And so she immediately hit her alarm, but then she jumped on this guy, to restrain him so that he wouldn't continue hacking at his wrists with this razor blade, right? And other people who saw it she was pretty emotional about it. It was, I don't know if it was traumatizing, but it was definitely intense. Other people who saw it was intense for them, and we definitely had to sit down and have a talk about that afterwards, and just let people share how they're feeling and and express whatever they're feeling, the frustration, the whatever emotions are coming up, and letting that be okay. I think
I'm having it's challenging for me to understand why doing that, implementing that type of process was foreign. Is because the other places I've worked, there's commonly you have that space. Was that space just never created or accepted, or thought that it was needed in that type of setting for the clinicians?
I think I certainly can't speak for the entire prison system as a whole, but maybe in other institutions they have some time for this. But part of the problem is that it's a lack of resources. We've got an abundance of patients and a limited number of clinicians, and it just seems like it's really hard to get our arms wrapped around the workload. So the workload sometimes can be so intense and so there's so much of it, and then the corresponding documentation to go with it, that just creating time for a process group, particularly if it's during business hours when the program is up and running, providing patient care, you're taking away time from patient care, which then reflects on the metrics. And the institution as a whole is really, not just the institution, but the entire state prison system. One of its objectives is to get out from underneath this massive lawsuit that it's dealing with and has been for 20 years. And so there's a big push to meet metrics. And I imagine that's true in just about any setting, whether it's litigated or not, that whether it's a community mental health or some kind of nonprofit agency, that there is there's always more work to be done, and there's only so many resources. And so if you choose to create space to take care of your clinicians, then it's a trade-off, right? You have to sacrifice something somewhere else. I think it's a good investment, and I think it's a trade-off worth making, particularly in the long run. Right. But it's one of these activities that doesn't necessarily have much urgency to it, right? And so many times I think it's an extremely important activity, but it's if you remember Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, he talks about importance and urgency. And the things that are important but not necessarily urgent many times get forgotten, or we procrastinate in doing that. It requires someone to be very proactive to implement those non-urgent but important activities.
Well, you're championing that position, man. It's and you've got your flag up. I mean, it sounds like it's a really challenging spot that you've chosen to take.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I won't deny that. But we've been successful on that yard in the last 16 months. Part of it has also been, creating relationships not just within the mental health discipline, but also across disciplines with custody and with nursing and with medical, so it becomes more of a team environment. I think it's really sometimes easy in these large organizations for the different disciplines to become siloed.
Right.
And so it's really important to recognize that, hey, we're all playing on the same team here, right? We may have slightly different missions, but at the end of the day, we all want to get home safe to our families, right?
Yeah.
So
awesome. All right. So I had asked you about, look, I've got to have you back. Seriously, because there's so much to talk about. I mean, I'm thinking to myself, there's so many other ways and other kind of avenues we could talk about to contribute to this conversation, but we'll save that for a different time. I had asked earlier about any go-to book recommendations, and you said things were popping in your mind.
Yeah, there's a couple that come to mind. So I'll give you two, and these are two that I've really enjoyed more recently. And now this is less about like providing clinical treatment as a individual, and this is more about kind of for someone who's approaching this as a leader or from a position
Awesome.
of leadership. And so one is called The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. It came out in 2018, and it's subtitled The Secrets of Highly Successful Groups.
Okay, got it. Awesome.
And then the other book is by Brené Brown. She's made her mark on the research of shame, but she also, her most recent book is about on leadership, and I think it's called Braving Leadership. Dare to Lead, excuse me.
Awesome. Yeah.
So that's a really good one as well. And what's interesting is when you start looking at these topics, they're all kind of saying much the same thing. Like, for example, one of the things that both of them talk about, which is also supported by the research that Google has done, is that when developing and when you're talking about teams, the most important thing about for teams is psychological safety, right? So you have to create an environment of psychological safety where the individuals feel they can risk being wrong and not being shamed or mocked, or that it's okay to make mistakes, right? Without that psychological safety, then your team is going to be far less effective. And I think much more prone to vicarious trauma in the settings like I work in.
Awesome. So once again, The Culture Code, The Secrets of Highly Successful Groups by Coyle, and Dare to Lead, Brave Work, Tough Conversations, Whole Hearts, Brené Brown. I'll have those linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. All right. Once again, I'm speaking with Damon Wood. Damon, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you? All those people who are going to want to say, I want to work in prison.
Well, let's see. That my professional email address is damonwoodphd@gmail.com.
Okay. Awesome. I'll have that linked up here. Damon, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. And I feel like we're just scratching the surface on this topic. So
we are. I'll have you back. But again, thanks so much. Take care.
My pleasure. All right. Take care.
The Foundation for Human Enrichment, DBA Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute, is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to resolving trauma worldwide by providing professional training and education in somatic experiencing. It was founded by Dr. Peter Levine, author of Waking the Tiger, who developed somatic experiencing based on explorations of how animals deal with threat and traumatic experiences on a daily basis. Learn more about somatic experiencing and the SE professional training at www.traumahealing.org. That's www.traumahealing.org. All right, guys, this episode is sponsored by Trauma Therapist 2.0, community to educate, support, to inspire new trauma healers. If you're a new trauma worker, new trauma provider and healer, you're starting out on the trauma-informed journey and you're tired of doing this alone and looking for support, looking to be around a community.
Hey, my pleasure. And I feel like we're just scratching the surface on this topic. So
We are. I'll have you back. But again, thanks so much. Take care.
My pleasure. All right, take care.
The Foundation for Human Enrichment, DBA Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute, is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to resolving trauma worldwide by providing professional training and education in somatic experiencing. It was founded by Dr. Peter Levine, author of Waking the Tiger, who developed somatic experiencing based on explorations of how animals deal with threat and traumatic experiences on a daily basis. Learn more about somatic experiencing and the SE professional training at www.traumahealing.org. That's www.traumahealing.org. All right, guys, this episode is sponsored by Trauma Therapist 2.0, community to educate, support, to inspire new trauma healers. If you're a new trauma worker, new trauma provider and healer, you're starting out on the trauma-informed journey and you're tired of doing this alone and looking for support, looking to be around a community of other passionate trauma clinicians, I invite you to check out Trauma Therapist 2.0 at traumatherapist2.com. That's traumatherapist2.com.